Good afternoon and welcome to our Ask Them webinar series. This is Claudia Williams. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a program officer at Washington Area Women's Foundation. For those of you who are new to the foundation, we are a foundation supported by people like you, and we invest in women, girls, and non-binary people of color because we know they make change happen. The Ask series is a space where we highlight and uplift the work of leaders who are building a better world. And we see this space as a safe place to ask the hard questions, have candid conversations, be accountable to each other, and call our community to action. Today, I want to tell you about Angelique. She is an early care and education worker here in the Washington, D.C. region. She's telling her story to change the narrative about the value and importance of family childcare. She's working closely with one of our grantee partners, Spaces in Action. And while she is telling her story and going through this storytelling journey, she's also healing and stepping into her power, because Spaces in Action is using a healing justice framework to their organizing. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. How can we support activists and organizers to continue their fight for liberation while also healing from intergenerational trauma? Healing justice is also integral to the fight against anti-Blackness and white supremacy, which is something that is very important for us at the Women's Foundation. And while this is a new framework for us and we are just starting to incorporate it into our work, we want to uplift the conversation. Please feel free to engage with us today, dropping your questions on the Q&A box and also on social media, sharing your thoughts and reflections using the hashtag #AskThem and #AskHer series. To start, I want to introduce our speakers. I can't imagine a better pair of organizers and visionaries for Black liberation to be chatting with us today. I'm so happy to have with us Cara Page and Richael Faithful. They are both cultural workers and healing practitioners supporting activists in the fight for social change. Cara has been organizing for over 20 years to support communities, to create strategies to intervene in intergenerational trauma. And Richael is committed to cultivating moments and spaces for healing. And they are also known for supporting activists in identifying and processing trauma and incorporating healing justice into their work. Welcome, Cara and Richael. I am so honored to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Always a pleasure.
To start, I want to ask you a question about how did you start this work on healing justice? How did you came to this work? And a little bit about your background.
So just briefly, I wanted to show some slides just to introduce healing justice. Again, my name is Cara Page, she, her, hers. I'm coming to you by way of Lenape land in Brooklyn, New York. My work has been deeply rooted in the South. I lived in the South for 20 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and Durham, North Carolina. And my people are from the South, Black Seminole in Florida, and African-American migrant sharecroppers from Georgia and North Carolina. So that is really what led me to returning to the South, which is one of my very political cultural homes. For myself as a curator, as a cultural worker, and organizer, and healing practitioner, it was very important to understand the role of healing is integral to political liberation. So we always talk about the communities of healers and organizers that I work with in the Southeast and now across the country and the world. When we talk about the US Southeast beginnings of the healing justice political framework, it was to understand a political moment in the early 2000s of this inside the US with a backdrop of increased fascist, white supremacist violence in the early 2000s that very much repeats and mimics the same heightened violence we're experiencing now. But in that moment in the early 2000s in the South in particular, we were responding as movement organizers to generational trauma, to burnout in our movements, to long-term stress from state violence, communal violence, interpersonal violence, and systemic oppression. So we asked the question, how do we center the role of healing as politically integral to our strategies? And how do we center the role of practitioners, be they healers, nurses, doctors, social workers, to understand that our work can be transformed as movements, social justice movements in this country? How are we understanding the role of practitioners? And for us, it was very important to be rooted in a global South context, to explore abolition and Black feminist and Black indigenous radical traditions as part of the formation of our work. Healing justice also was always survivor-led and community-led, which essentially meant to us that what we believe around our individual, collective, spiritual, psychic healing and well-being has everything to do with, it must be led by our communities. And we learned a lot during Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2006, because that was a marker for understanding how the state will respond to natural disasters or physical, emotional crises, and how communities will respond. And as we watch the state commit heinous violence and crimes on Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and migrant communities, queer and trans communities after that storm, it set the standard for what we believe communities can do to provide natural disaster care. And then beyond that, beyond rapid response, what is the comprehensive way we provide care for each other? Next slide. I'll just quickly touch on healing justice to toss it to my co-panelists. So what's important to note is healing justice is a political strategy. It was not meant to be a movement. For us in the Southeast, it was important that we create a strategy that was integrated inside of all movements to intervene on generational trauma from systemic violence and oppression and policing, and to also recover and remember our ancestral traditions and medicines, and also build new ones that center our psychic, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental well-being for collective liberation. Next slide. It's been also important for us to center our values. As Southern healers, we always led with that collective trauma can be transformed, and that we don't need to depend on state or privatized ideas of care that will define for us how to transform trauma. We also believe that there is no single model or right way to care, that it's always expansive, and that we cannot be defined by one model of caring for each other, that it's comprehensive. There's different traditions of care, healing, safety, so it's always in motion. That community must have autonomy and agency in how we choose to heal our communities, and healing strategies are rooted in place. That for us in the South, it was always about what are the traditions of healing and strategies of survival that have been deeply embedded in Black, Indigenous, people of color, working class, queer and trans, people with disabilities. How have we survived cultural, political contexts and conditions in our region? And finally, that healing justice is anti-capitalist, always rooted in a Black feminist abolitionist lens, and centers 4 movements or analyses: disability justice, reproductive justice, transformative justice, and environmental justice. And I just want to give credit. I'll just do one more slide for my slide curator. Where this all began is we started a collective of healers, health practitioners, and organizers. Next slide. And that's the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. And the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective was a Black feminist-led, multiracial, intergenerational, queer, and ally network of Southern-based social justice healers, birth workers, therapists, social workers, folks that wanted to organize integrative care strategies rooted in movement and rooted in transforming generational trauma from colonization and oppression. And we can switch to Rochelle. That is my work. That is where I am most rooted and grounded in. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. It's always so just powerful to see not only the frame that I know you did not individually create, but you continue to kind of collect and archive for us, and to see it evolve over time. So I always am moved by seeing like the iteration of the kind of insight that you all are bringing, and appreciate all the foundation you've built for this framework. Grateful to see so many of you all friends that I'm connected to in community. And how did I come to this work? So I was, like many people, an organizer early in life. I was politicized by coming out as queer in high school in Virginia, which is the other home of mine other than DC. And through college, learned more traditional forms of organizing that also felt really fragmented to me. And it wasn't until a little bit later on in my 20s, I connected to Southerners on New Ground, who is, you know, like a sibling organization to Kindred and many of these other Southern-based groups that were really developing these more radical visions about how to do our work. And that was the first time I was ever asked, like, can you integrate your land, your relationship to land, your body, your spirit, and your work as being part of you, and how you move through, you know, move through organizing, as opposed to a model that was focused on like numbers and getting people mobilized. And it really changed me. So not surprisingly, holistic organizing brought me into the frame of healing justice around the same time that Kindred was like really beginning to organize. So I was a little bit further north, but stayed connected to that constellation of people. And it's beautiful how like we have been able to cross-pollinate over time. In my own journey, I moved away from organizing because I realized the paid relationship to organizing changed my relationship to it in ways that I felt more distant from it. So I made a very conscious choice to become a lawyer and to be a community lawyer. That was a really important work for me as well. But in doing that work, I found that so often I didn't actually have effective ways to support people legally, right? Just based on the legal structures that exist. I wasn't actually able to address people's needs and concerns. We did some policy work that was effective, but what was most powerful about that work for me was just the power of witness for folks who were having their lives consumed and their communities consumed, right, by mass incarceration. So for me, bearing witness was what I found to be, to me, much more powerful work, and to others, much more meaningful work. And that's actually just what I understand now to be a form of cultural work that I was being named in the time, right? It was invisible work in my lawyering work, but it was the work that was most important. So I answered kind of my own question to myself about how I wanted to, what kind of work I wanted to put at the forefront of my own life. So I left full-time lawyering, pursued, I was already actually involved in a meditation community. I'd already been involved with energy healing and other healing arts, but decided to bring that to the forefront. That led me to shamanic arts, and that led me to the tradition, my own ancestral tradition of conjure, which is rooted also in the South. So my process of like remembering and reclaiming is, I think, common to a lot of people who have been just asking deeper and deeper questions that is embedded in this critique that Cara helped us understand, right? Which is the more we understand how so many systems not only fail us, but are designed to work against us, we just ask more questions that lead us to traditions, practices, skills that have worked for us for a long time in reality, right? In our collective safety and also our collective well-being. So one thing that I stress here in kind of the DC area as we do this work, and we're deepening it here in DC in ways that are very exciting to me, but still a framework that I think is still new to a lot of us, is, you know, what are actually our very local practices that are unique to our place. That's something we're still developing and having, I think, deep and wonderful conversations about. Not that they don't already exist, but we're trying to identify them as such and resource them as such. And also to not separate our kind of healers from our political strategizing. I always explain to healers especially those who are already a little political, right? Like those are not separate identities that, in fact, to be an effective, to actually like be an effective healer is to identify and know intergenerational trauma and how to hold and support that, not only individually, but collectively, right? And the same token, speaking to my organizer friends who are skeptical about healing, really giving them the space to actually like be more human and to appreciate what the transformative power of care, right? And ways we continue to integrate our work together, because one thing that Cara always stresses that is so important is that healing justice is about that strategy making, right? Our political strategy making. It's not something separate. So we're doing that integration work in DC, which is really exciting. And that's some of the work that I do, but I'm excited to share more about that here in a little bit.
So interesting, Richael. I really heard you talking about how the systems sometimes are oppressing us. And that leads us to our next question. Cara, I know that you are doing an archiving project about the medical industrial complex. And we are right now at a time where we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And this time is really asking us to slow down and really redefine how can we change and adapt so we can create that space for that collective care and safety and protection. So Cara, I wanted to ask you, what does the medical industrial complex, how does it intersect with this political moment we're living right now, and also with this public health crisis that we're living?
Thank you so much. Michelle, I really appreciate what you offered in the story. I think in response to Claudia's question, is to understand the role of memory work on how we have survived attempted genocide and colonization for many of our people, right? That the consequence of the original wounds of slavery and colonization has deeply impacted all of our well-being, whether or not we're willing to wrestle with that or not. White supremacy has a deep impact on our psychic, spiritual, physical, mental well-being, no matter what community you come from, right? So this, for us, inside of Healing Justice, I think the call to action has been, how then do you hold two things: the memory of lineage of what traditions we have held that worked for us. Let me not say they all worked, but what we have done to survive crisis, attempted genocide, slavery, massive incarceration, 9/11, natural disasters, so on and so forth, right? But this holding the other balance of the institutions that already exist that were rooted in a white supremacist, gender supremacist, ableist idea of who can be healthy and who can be well, and a capitalist idea that people's health is only dependent on whether or not they're reproducing labor and profit for the wealthy elite. Wait, so let's just say that again. That can it be? Yes, it can. That in this country and in the world, that some systems of healthcare have been ultimately defined and rooted in this archaic idea of protecting only some kind of bodies based on who is reproducing labor for the wealthy elite. So inside of the medical industrial complex, how I come to determine that by way of Black feminists, Indigenous feminists, Global South feminist writings about the medical industrial complex has been very key to the reproductive justice movement, disability justice movement, gender justice movement. Folks like Dorothy Roberts, Harriet Washington, who have torn apart this concept of a system that we relied on for care that became a site of absolute danger, experimentation, and testing. Fast forward, we're in a global pandemic, COVID-19 lands, and suddenly, no matter what your race, ability, gender, access to education, so on and so forth, we are all shut down at the same time and all dependent on the state. And for some of us, that is not an option. For others, it's an option. But it becomes inside of a political conversation of white supremacy and defunding the police and alternatives to responding to mental illness or mental health first responders. Those political questions inside of COVID-19 asked the question, is there a way to look at healing and care through an abolitionist frame that doesn't rely on the state to tell us, what, are we well? How can we be well? And what does it mean to be hospitalized, or to have the state determine for you whether or not you can move inside of your home, literally, whether or not you can go to work, and who's essential and who is not. And that brought folks to the brink of breaking open this idea of, wait, what is the healthcare system in this country? And that's when people started to ask the question, are we relying on care models that aren't conducive to the well-being of our communities? And we love that. I love that opportunity for myself as a culture worker, as a memory worker. I always say this is memory work, because if we don't know that the public health system was rooted in a anti-immigrant, ethnic cleansing, anti-Black racist frame, not to mention ableist and homophobic and transphobic, if we're not wrestling with where the public health system has come from, there's no way to transform how it will meet our needs as a country. So that being said, I have seen work done, tremendous work for people who are incarcerated. I've seen work happening around disability justice and challenging the eugenic practices of some medical hospitals, medical facilities that are needing to choose who can get access to ventilators sooner or later based on, well, who is more expendable based on their ability, physical, mental, emotional ability. This is old ideas coming to the surface, right? And it is harmful, dangerous, violent. I've also seen the such rise of visibility around issues of healthcare in general, not just around COVID, but around other medical abuses and harm. And again, I'm pro-science, but I'm pro-safe science that does not harm or abuse our people and doesn't misuse medicine as a scapegoat to continue to control and police our people and our bodies. So one example is the Irwin County Detention Center in Southern Georgia with the nurse, Dawn Wooten, a Black nurse, who said, wait a minute, this detention center is massively sterilizing many immigrant women in this facility, and it's gotta stop. And she took tremendous risk to tell that story. And now more detainees and former detained people are stepping up saying, wait a minute, I was sterilized too. And so I'm gonna drop in some links for folks to learn more about this. But I think what this moment is telling us is it's a reckoning that people are starting to understand for themselves, for their communities, for our general public, what will we ask for our political, social, emotional well-being and physical well-being in a moment of COVID? What does it mean to rely on state, to rely on big pharma to determine our future when our past has been so deeply embedded in experimentation, testing, and not conducive conditions for our people?
Yes, I'm actually going to riff off of that, Claudia, if you don't mind, just for a second, because I think it's so important to help us all draw these connections that Cara is making. So, first, so often, at least in the United States, it's true that to understand the deep impact of our colonial present and white supremacist present, it has to reach a certain level of reckoning for mostly white affluent folks to really be translated and understood. And in this moment with the pandemic, when we're on the verge of having a vaccine approved in the US after a number of other countries have approved the Pfizer vaccine, of course, there's high levels of people who are skeptical about the safety of this vaccine, but particularly, Black Americans are highly skeptical more than almost any other group about whether this vaccine will be safe. So folks have been citing, right, things like the Tuskegee, right, syphilis experiments as the legacy of that abuse that Cara is bringing into the present for us as a focal point. But so many other people are also like saying, hey, first there's so much other history to point to about abuse, exploitation, connected to eugenics movement. And even in the present, right, we still have even fundamental problems of people who are receiving medical care, particularly African Americans, who can't receive pain medication because there's still strong myths that Black folks don't feel pain the same way as other people, right? And how global, right, this complex also is, right? Because as more and more people are understanding and learning about the history of Tuskegee, we also are learning that there are very similar terrible experiments that went on in Guatemala, also, perpetrated by the same institutions in Hopkins, right? That intentionally did not disclose the purpose of their medical experiments to prisoners and sex workers, folks who would not be able, right, to have the same kind of remedies for that kind of exploitation and abuse. And that's coming to light now. And there's also, again, so precious little that the legal system is going to do for these people, but it allows us to bring that level of scrutiny to the present. I'll make one more point and then kind of get into like why that memory work is so important, but also like really connect to our vision about where we need to go. So I think another thing that we have to also draw the connection to as we think about what's being revealed about the medical industrial complex to some people, but what's been known to other people, is a connection to our environment, right? So, there's a lot of different theories, some are more true than not about the emergence of this version of SARS, but we do know that ecological devastation, right, that's industry driven and profit driven, is resulting in a number of unexpected medical consequences that we have to then deal with, right? That only get exacerbated through our healthcare systems that are actually not really caring for folks and that are so profit driven. So if we understand, like if we really understand the healing justice lens, we're understanding how our well-being is shaped by these systems that feel so big, like white supremacy and ecological devastation, and the medical industrial complex, but really are interconnected in our realities at this moment, right? So if we can really make those connections, we're really beginning to see how the cumulative effect, right, is really coming to bear at this moment and will only continue to escalate the more that we allow these systems to operate as they have, and the ways that we continue to invest in their systems when we do have other choices and options. So an option that many people in my community here in DC were choosing, right, is we will engage and challenge and resist those systems as we need to. And part of the memory work is allowing us to have that care and access that's otherwise been denied to us, or even not only denied to us, but like systemically even outlawed in some cases, right? So people are doing basic things like learning how to grow food at their home and their herbs at home that will give them care, right? And in some places it's still legal to do some certain forms of that, even in Georgia, right? We are learning how to even informally bring together grief circles as we're all dealing with different levels of grief, particularly through this year, whether that's loss of people and lives, or to even just like our way of being and sense of support and safety. We are building in more like somatic awareness work, right? So that we're not just moving through the world, not aware of that connection between our bodies and everything else, right? Holistically moving through the world. So we're beginning to integrate those practices in our work. And there's beautiful work that's happening with public art and altars and other things. We could talk more about it, but for me, part of my role in indigenizing, right, helping us indigenize and remember those practices is, the more that we can remember what's worked, the more effective we can also like innovate, right? So one of the things that I do, and a lot of other people are doing, is like, we're not remembering just for the sake of remembering, that is very important, but we're really trying to understand how those practices become legible today, right? And actually respond to our needs now, especially given all the urgency that exists. So there's an Afro-retrist perspective, right, for me, and also an Afro-futurist perspective, which is we are envisioning our futures, not in this idealized past that sometimes people have about what's happened before, but from a future that can really be shaped by our most courageous survival that's already happened that allows us to be here now. So I just want to draw those connections for all of us. And I know Cara will continue to draw different connections, but I think that the power of the healing justice framework is it begins to help us understand how interconnected all these realities are.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Richelle. It was very interesting to learn more about how you are indigenizing healing practices. And I was thinking while you were talking, how can philanthropy resource this work better? At the Women's Foundation, we are doing some changes to our grant making to really support our grantee partners in a more holistic way. We are moving away from project funding and we are giving them general operating support because we know they need that flexibility. It's impossible to plan for everything, and they need to be responding to different issues emerging. And not only that, but they need flexibility to create that infrastructure that we are talking about to build collective care and safety. I know you both have worked closely with philanthropy to support them and provide more guidance on how we can embrace this healing justice framework. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about how can we push mainstream philanthropy to really embrace this framework, and how can we resource the work that you were talking about a little bit better?
Do you want to, I can jump in. Okay, cool. So thanks for asking that question, Claudia. I think it's very important for myself as a former funder, as director of programs at the Estrella Foundation, and also now advising several foundations, public and private, on healing justice, collective care, and safety strategies. And I want to be clear, the healing justice framework is a very US-based framework. Again, that was rooted in the South and Black feminist led. What we found out is simultaneously to the early 2000s, while we were responding to a particular context and condition of the Southeast in this country, at the same time, we were also watching the global South and the different kinds of initiatives and strategies in other parts of the world that healers were leading on, that was also through an anti-capitalist power building frame. One example I like to give is in Peru in 2006, a whole conglomeration or gathering, convening of convergence, that's the word, of healers came together who were fighting for their right to continue creating traditional indigenous healing traditions, and also to decriminalize healers for carrying forth their traditions. And they actually fought for the change of the Constitution that would protect indigenous healers and traditions in Peru. And when I saw that, when Kindred and other healers asked that question, we're like, yes, how do we decriminalize practitioners, and how do we decriminalize our traditions? And where do philanthropists show up on that? That philanthropists are not just funding, and someone asked a question about this, on the side, healing justice practice spaces where healers are just keeping movement organizers warm and safe and well. But they're actually at the decision-making table building power analysis around the role of healing as a political strategy towards our future, towards building collective care, collective safety, collective liberation, and that there's no separation between anti-policing and decriminalizing healers. It's the same conversation. So we were really about politicizing, and we are still, that healing justice is about politicizing the role of practitioners. Another example that I give philanthropists often is birth workers. Many women's funds especially that are funding abortion work, that are funding birth workers to do care strategies in prisons, detention centers, outside of prisons and detention centers. Where are we holding the line on the safety and care of people, queer and trans, migrant, disabled communities in this country, when we know the state or private corporations will not do that? Where are foundations funding that work through a gender justice, racial justice lens? And asking, where's the commitment of foundations? Yes, to carte blanche say, here's a multi-year general operating grant. You choose how you will work with practitioners, not just to sustain your staff or sustain your base. Your healers are the base. They are already integrated to that. So the question is, how will funding allow for the spaciousness for people to turn and say, we're going to have increased natural disasters. And I consider a natural disaster is this federal government currently right now, right? We're going to have increased white supremacy, no matter who's in the office. We're going to see white supremacist violence, xenophobic violence, population control, and still the production of massive incarceration and detainment. So if that's happening, where is there a healing strategy inside of the political work our movements are doing, and where do foundations fund that work and trust organizers to name it, not extract what they're doing, just say, we're integrating care and safety strategies. We don't want to share all of them with you. That puts our people at risk, but trust that this is the work we need to do that is central to our organizing work. I really hope this is making sense. And then finally, supporting long-term infrastructure. I don't want to be asking the same questions 10 years from now that we were asking in 2010 at the People's Movement Assembly, what to our knowledge is the first convergence of healers, health practitioners, school nurses, doctors, birth workers, therapists, all looking at integrative care models through a social justice lens. And we had demands to our movements saying we want to leverage resources to politicize the role of healers, to decriminalize our traditions, and to make sure we're at the decision-making table on movement strategies. In 10 years, and I think things have changed, right? I think it looks more like that now. I'm supporting on the Breathe Act. Healing justice is in the Breathe Act. And for BL and Black Lives Matter put healing justice up as a political framework. Awesome. In 10 years from now, what will we actually say we've built that sustains people who are being tortured, detained, incarcerated, sterilized, experimented on? Like, what is it we are willing to shape and envision for the care of our people, natural disasters or not? What are we able to build long term? For folks to be able to tap into. Someone said to me, what are you trying to create, hospitals that aren't hospitals? You know, like something else? Sure, let's throw it up and shake it up a little, because the closure of hospitals in many of our regions, especially in the South, makes us ask the question, what will we put in the place of these hospitals, right? So that people aren't taking the risk to travel 60 miles just to get any kind of quality care. That's the first question, but where else are there gaps that we need to fill?
Yes, 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 and yes. You know, especially, you know, in DC, there are a few conditions we know that are true. We know that there's always been a lot of organizing, and there's been often like so many resources offered to, like, you know, all the national nonprofits that are here, and much fewer to folks who are organizing against, you know, everything from so many different kinds of people being put in cages to people's displacement to a range of other day-to-day, like violent realities that people face. So I am so glad to be part of the local philanthropic community now, because I see the role of, like, you know, local, regional funders to really make sure that gap gets filled among all the gaps Cara mentioned. And, you know, we do lack so much infrastructure in DC for organizers, even from basic places like before the pandemic hit, like places to meet. And so many organizers have also like struggled with who are doing critical work, right? And critical healing work, even with, you know, broadband access, you know, just a mile that way is not reliable, doesn't work, right? So we're talking about very basic like infrastructure, as well as infrastructure about how to support so many of our folks who are, survivors of multiple traumas, continue to do this work, who are under surveillance, and don't have the support to do that work, right? In ways that don't add and compound trauma and lead to significant conflict, right? So one thing that some of us have been asking recently is like, there's conflict everywhere, and conflict, I know, across the movement landscape, but in DC, it seems like we have a movement culture that's really steeped in a lot of conflict and harm. And I see a correlation there, right? The lack of our healing justice infrastructure, I think, is deeply connected to that movement culture that we see, right? So if we are actually not only diverting the dollars, as Cara said, trusting the organizers to do what they need to do by giving them general operating multi-year funding with no strings attached, and allowing them to build up that infrastructure, as well as people who want to build infrastructure, right? There are a number of people who want to, but need the resources and time to do so. And some folks have been doing scrappily, as we always do. But, what if we actually properly funded those folks and trusted them with other forms of resources that they need to build it out? So, I'm grateful in DC that we have a lot of visions. We just need more dollars and more trust for that to move. And so we're not in the place, as Cara said, we're not asking the same questions in even 2 years, right, than we were asking a decade ago. And that's just necessitated by the urgency of our time. So I think there's a lot of shifting that folks are beginning to make, but it does require philanthropy and funders to also be transformed, right? Be transformed in this work and begin its own reorientation and divestment from corporate practices and other kind of like control-based practices that aren't rooted in people, not rooted in trust, not rooted in wholeness, and or at least humanity, like our humanness, right, our fullness as people in this world, right, that's interconnected. That is what I think will require the change too, right? I'm sure Cara has a lot to say about this, or may not say it today, but like, philanthropy is cleaning up its own house, and that's been, a beautiful and difficult, right, unfolding to witness and be a part of.
Definitely.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Just to riff with Rochelle, and I love the questions being popped in the box. Woo, we don't have enough time. But Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective led with an analysis on economies, right? That's very Black feminist rooted and global Southern feminist, right? That you can't talk about healing, care, wellness, safety without talking about economy. And just to be clear, that we're always looking at how do we value the worth of practice? Like literally bartering and exchanging, what does it mean to hold care in exchange for like food, like you're saying, plant, earth-based medicines, food, where are we able to supply this for the well-being of our people? Herbs, practices, the same idea. Like before colonization, we were rolling that out. There was, and in some places there still are these exchanges and bartering of practice and traditions. And so for us, it was always asking the question, what are the traditional economies we can lean on for our collective well-being and safety? And so, and pulling that apart changes the dynamic of, I feel, of seeing healing then only as a byproduct. And some people have written self-care only becoming something around, or care becoming only something associated to labor. But we're actually talking about care being associated to the lineage of survival and revolution. Like, how is it a liberatory practice to care for ourselves and each other outside of state mechanisms of survival?
Definitely everything that you're mentioning. Yes, yes, yes. And now to wrap up, without giving some time to the audience to ask their questions, I would like to transition the conversation to the questions and answers, and Mercy will help us with that. Can you read the first question, Mercy?
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions. One is from Ariana, who says, how can philanthropy, a system traditionally focused on impact and metrics, avoid treating healing as a commodity, healing as a means for sustaining organizers, movement leaders who are viewed essentially as labor, tools for change? How can funders and advocates lead and nourish this work with love and care?
I actually answered that in my response to that question already, because I saw that. So
Wonderful,
and I
because
think
that's how
Rochelle
awesome
answered
you
that
are.
too.
Me too, I also
Okay,
yeah.
I was like, I feel like we answered that. Okay.
Okay, great. I'm making sure we didn't miss that one. So what advice do you have for those who see the value of healing justice and collective care, try to implement it, some of those practices, and are ill-informed of the consequences of doing so? I'm speaking specifically to white-led organizations curating this content as a means to support their own individual institutional agendas.
So just to be clear, Kindred Collective, that was an architect, we coined the phrase healing justice, but there are white people inside of the collective as well. Like, this is not a POC only. We're saying we rooted the framework through a Black, Indigenous, people of color lens, because it is no question that our traditions and our survival are more criminalized, period. So to that I say, always practice is rooted in place. White people of European descent have access to traditions and don't need to co-opt from other communities of color. Black, Indigenous, and people of color don't need to co-opt from each other. Like, there are really full questions in how we move with intention and integrity, and don't steal from each other. No matter what ethnic, cultural background you come from, there's always that risk because of capitalism and white supremacy that we're stealing from one another and not asking permission to understand the practices. So for us as the Kindred Collective, we always ask, whoever is doing the practice, say it's me, I come and say, this is the lineage of this practice. This is my teacher. We don't consult or contract people that haven't been in practice less than 5 years. That's very important to us so that we understand that they know their practice. And I'm not saying 5 years is a deep dive, but I'm saying someone who just learned something 5 months ago, it takes discipline and rigor, y'all. That's like saying you're going to be a professional flautist and you just picked up the flute. So we believe in deep practice. And so there's always risk in introducing practices to any community, but we always feel you have to roll with intention and the grace and the permission that you would have permission from that community or that teacher that's showing you that practice, and you bring that with you wherever you do it. Does that make sense? So in the context of someone saying white folks or white-led organizations, I would hope they're tapping into European traditions, period. But they also are coming with analysis, history, lineage, and know where those practices come from.
Perfect.
100%. 100%. Yes. And one other thing I'll add, I think that's true about our area here, is that there's still so many conversations that need to be had with organizers as well, right? So if this is about also like having money flow or resources flow, you don't have to guess. You really can, as Cara said, right? Just like be able to map and identify the folks who are, just ask, right? Who are the folks who are doing this work very deeply, right? Even if they call it by a different name, but who is doing this work? And just do some listening. That can help too, right? So it doesn't mean you have to co-opt those practices, but if you're at the beginning of really understanding what this actually means, offering some deep listening, and then also like compensating people for their time and their wisdom is really like actionable stuff that many, I think, funders can do, and that's probably a stage that many of us are at.
Yes, yes, and I forgot to say, and ask the permission of the people in your organizations, because what we're also seeing, and this is my terminology, not Kindred's, is forced intimacy. For myself as an organizer and trainer and practitioner for about, now it's been 30 plus years, I never, or I try not to ever assume that everyone in the room wants to engage in a practice that can be triggering, that can be dangerous, that can be irresponsible. So even if it matches or aligns with what you assume to be the cultural representation of who's in the room, I always ask, is this a practice you feel comfortable being a part of? And give them the option to opt out. Because what I'm seeing is organizations saying, we're gonna heal, this is what's up, we're gonna do it together right now. And that represents a very curative model that the disability justice movement has pushed up against. It's the same idea. I'm gonna come in and fix you by bringing this one practice. And if you're not changed, then you obviously cannot be transformed. That sounds like the state police or policing the state, right? Policing from the state. So we're not trying to perpetuate that same idea of all will be fixed and all will be changed. That's impossible, y'all. Intergenerational trauma touches us on many different levels.
And I think this next question from Noor is a good segue. Are there any practical applications or reading resources y'all can recommend? I would like to read more. It's hard to bring up healing justice in political movements with my communities, Indigenous Palestinians, where we've always had to be re-traumatizing ourselves to prove our worth.
Yes, yes, and yes. So one of the movements or analyses that deeply intersects with healing justice is transformative justice. It's like that we are always assumed to be working, well, for us, we were assuming to be working out of state because we were working with highly charged in the South. We did a tremendous amount of work around Islamophobia, post 9/11, certainly with our comrades in Palestine, also learning from ways you have confronted generations of trauma and grief. What does that look like? And not to be irresponsible with how you open these conversations. So I'm gonna drop some tools in the chat, but transformharm.org, I just wanna there's different resources on that page, which I think open up a lot of dialogue around abolition, around grief, but we have a piece on there on Kindred on healing justice and how that evolved at the US Social Forum in 2010, when we brought people together to talk about what does it mean to even center generational trauma in our organizing work as survivors of state violence and communal violence. So I just want to give that as a resource, but I do have a list of HJ resources as well, as I'm sure Rochelle does too, so I'll just drop them in the chat.
Fantastic. Next question here. We have about 2 or 3 more questions. Cara and Rochelle, if you're comfortable sharing, what does self-care look like for you during the pandemic?
You know, it's a question I get a lot. What I can say is that my practices have changed in some ways. And I'm returning to some things that have been supportive to me over time. They tend to be, for me, seasonal. And they tend to be connected. You know, if I could like change anything about how we talk about care, and Kara's already brought this up, is like even moving away from the concept of self-care, because the reality is, especially someone who's just deeply rooted in community, right? My well-being is tremendously impacted on how my other kindred are doing, right? And you know, in some ways, this year has been so just lessonful about everything, but especially about like how people survive, right? And survive incredible events happening at all levels at once. So even though like there might be parts of my life that are more resilient, I know there's so many of our folks who are really, we're already like being annihilated, right, through these systems, and there's even more pressure or ways in which they are being hurt through these realities that already exist. So I just want to offer that, like, I don't mind sharing more of that, but I really would have us continue to be thinking about it. And the disability justice, right, our folks in those movements, steeped in those movements, I think have a lot to share and have shared about collective care. So I'll encourage folks to, and I'll drop like a couple other things here in the chat for us to really be thinking about that framework. And it doesn't mean that we're always together at the same time doing the same things, but it is identifying that, like, if you're deeply like connected to other people, that like your well-being and practices have to be connected to theirs too.
Yeah, and I would just add, as I'm scrambling to find the links to all of these things, there's a lot more resources out there on healing justice. Oh, thanks. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll send you all a list later. That sounds great. So I have one more link. But what I want to say is that we were too busy. We were on the ground doing in real time work with organizers. As Rochelle mentioned, we were working with Southerners on New Ground, Project South, GLAR, Georgia Latino Human Rights Organization. Like, we were actually doing in real time as Kindred, organizing on the ground, doing healing strategies in a political moment starting in the early 2000s. Then fast forward, other organizations started to create spaces around healing justice, like Audre Lorde Project in New York. That's kind of what got me here. I can't go into the history of it, but I just want to name that we didn't have time to document what healing justice was because we were embodying it and just doing it. So now Kindred is out of responsibility to what we feel is an anti-Black, anti-Southern diffusion of the history and lineage, not of care and healing. That's not anyone's, we don't own that, but of Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective's origin story. We're pushing it out more, so it's very clear what we were thinking and what the South was responding to, and who we were in relationship to in the global South. Again, these conversations have been voluminous throughout different parts of the world on how do we transform grief, trauma, and harm to our collective bodies. So that being said, in terms of what I've been doing in COVID, it's what I've been doing all my last 30 plus years is collectively meeting with other practitioners on how will we hold this moment. We'll be changed forever from COVID, right? And I am deeply honored actually that this moment has given time for pause, reflection, grief, and change. Because on a cosmological level, so much is going on right now. Interplanetary shifts are happening right now. There's more full moons this year. There's so much changing in the world. It's not just on the physical plane, right? It's everywhere. So there are indigenous organizers, healers, gathering in spaces that they hadn't in a very long time, saying this is the beginning of a new cycle, which brings us pause, gives us pause, allows us to lose and shed some things, which includes death and grief, and to meet a new moment. And what does that mean? What will we learn from what we have lost and what we are bringing with us forward? So inside of that, I've been sitting in grief circles. I've been sitting with organizers and artists and culture workers who lost their jobs, their organizations, their homes overnight. I've been doing trainings on grief and trauma for organizers fighting white supremacists who were deeply, deeply traumatized by white supremacist violence during organizing, and needed a way to move that energy and to grieve for the loss of something in facing a white supremacist abuse and harm directly on the front lines. So I do think this is the work I've been doing, but yes, it had a different tenor, it had a different urgency because we were surrounded at the same time by so much death from COVID-19. But it was never self-care. I think self-care is the same way that art has been individualized. For us, I choose to use the term cultural worker. And I'm not saying that artists are always not rooted to community, but what I'm trying to say is that whatever creation or healing work I do, it's always in relationship to others. And self-care, through a very capitalist lens, presumes you can only heal, grieve by yourself. And I just don't believe that's true. And unfortunately, care and healthcare is also based on that. When you're not able to heal your family and your community, when you just come in for one doctor appointment, like there aren't 10 people that you're bringing in with you psychically and psychologically, because they're a part of your care too. So I just want to offer, is it self-care? No, I think it's collective care that I'm deeply in practice with during COVID and beyond.
Thank you so much for your responses and your insights and your thoughts on how we can take advantage of this unique moment in time to change and to reimagine the systems that are surrounding us. We're coming about time with our conversation, but I don't want to wrap up before reading one of our questions. I feel like I have many questions, but don't know what they are yet. I am thinking about caregiving and memory. Is it possible to have another conversation in the future? So definitely, this is something that we need to be continue talking about. We are very excited to have had you, Cara and Richael. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. We are very happy and honored to be embracing this framework of healing justice, and we definitely want to continue uplifting this conversation. So please feel free to check our website so you can learn more about our work, about our Stand Together Fund, to find ways to donate and engage, and also to read more and watch more of our Ask series conversations. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you so much. What an honor and beautiful to be invited to your community virtually. Thank you so much.
And thanks for convening us. I'm excited about our conversations.
So and there's questions about donation. Sure, Give to Kindred Collective. Richael, I don't know where they can give. There's many organizations doing healing justice work. So, but in particular in the South, Project South, Southerners on New Ground, just keep giving to the South.
I co-sign that. In DC, there's a number of different efforts, many are more informal. So one place I can lift up is Healers for Liberation Network that brings together.
Thank you.
Cara, I know you're connected to them too.
Of course, my bad. Yes, of course.
And we can share all of these links and all of the names of the organizations that you just mentioned in our follow-up email. So you make sure that you all have that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll send up some follow-up links also to our international folks in Palestine. I'll also drop in some links on collective care and safety. Some people asked about funders doing this work already. Urgent Action Fund, Groundswell Fund, and Foundation for a Just Society have been funding collective care and safety work and healing justice work for years. And they are expanding their strategies, so keep an eye out. There's more funders coming though with this strategy. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to end it here and we will send an email with all of the links and the recording. All right. Have a great day.
Thank you. Ciao, everyone. Be well, be safe, be transformed. All right.
Thank you.
Peace.